All right, let's dive into something that so many of us have wondered about. What are the signs, both the obvious and the really subtle ones, that you might be dating a partner with narcissistic traits? Today, we're going to break down the red flags, look at the real impact, and figure out what you can do to protect yourself. Okay, let's get into it. This quote from Psych Central just hits the nail on the head. They seem to lack any signs of empathy or vulnerability. It perfectly captures that feeling of an emotional disconnect, right? That sense that you're talking to someone who just isn't wired the same way when it comes to feelings. It's often the very first thing people notice, even if they can't quite name it yet. So, here's what we're going to cover. We'll start with that charming facade, when everything seems perfect. Then, we'll look at the cracks in the mirror, the warning signs. After that, we're doing a deep dive into something called the science of damage, which is super interesting. And finally, we'll talk about navigating the fallout and, most importantly, protecting yourself. Every story has a beginning, right? And when it comes to a relationship with a narcissistic partner, that beginning can feel like an absolute fairy tale. They can be so charming, so confident. It's like they're everything you've ever wanted. But as we're about to see, it's not always what it seems. So, one of the first things you might run into is this idea of love bombing. This is when a new partner just completely overwhelms you with affection, compliments, gifts, the whole shebang. But research shows this isn't just about being really into you. For people with high narcissistic traits and low self-esteem, it's actually a strategy to gain power and control from the get-go. It feels amazing, but it can be a form of manipulation. And look, this isn't some super rare thing we're talking about. It's estimated that narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD, affects up to 7.7% of guys and 4.8% of women. That means the chances of running into these traits in the dating world are, well, higher than you might think. So knowing the signs is really crucial. Okay, so after that initial whirlwind of charm, that perfect image can start to show some cracks. This is when the early warning signs, the red flags, start popping up. And it's all about paying attention to those patterns of behavior that just feel a little off. And these signs can show up surprisingly early, like even on a first date. For instance, watch how they treat the waitstaff. Is the conversation always, and I mean always, about them? Do they shy away from any question that would require them to be a little vulnerable? These kinds of subtle things on a first meeting can tell you a whole lot. Now, as a relationship gets deeper, the red flags can become a lot more serious. We're talking about moving past just a big ego to something much more concerning. This could be cruel teasing that definitely doesn't feel like a joke, a total lack of empathy for you or anyone else, or a habit of blaming everybody else for their problems. The key here isn't a one-time thing. It's the consistent pattern of these behaviors. And this quote from Psychology Today just cuts right to the chase. The biggest red flag is cruelty without remorse. This is maybe the most important thing to remember. It's not about someone making a mistake or accidentally hurting your feelings. It's about them causing pain and then showing zero regret. That lack of remorse, that's the real alarm bell. So this all leads to a really important question, doesn't it? We can see the behaviors, we can list out all the red flags, but what's the actual impact? Is this just someone who's kind of a jerk and difficult to be around, or are we talking about real, actual damage? To answer that, we're going to take up, well, a pretty unexpected turn. In this section, we're going to explore the science of how damage adds up over time, and we're going to use a metaphor from a totally different field of study to get our heads around the slow, creeping harm of emotional toxicity. I know what you're thinking. Mice and cigarette smoke? What's that have to do with anything? But trust me, stay with me on this. This study is a perfect physical model for what happens on a psychological level. Think about it. Constant, low-level exposure to a toxin is an incredible parallel to the day-in, day-out grind of being in a manipulative or unempathetic relationship. Okay, so the study had a few different groups, but we're going to focus on 3 that line up perfectly with relationship dynamics. First, you've got the sham group, breathing fresh air for 7 months. That's our healthy baseline. Then there's the 3R4F group, constantly exposed to cigarette smoke. That's our model for a chronically toxic relationship. And finally, the cessation group. This represents leaving that toxic environment and starting to heal. And this really gets to the heart of the idea. A big explosive fight, that's acute toxicity. It's obvious, you feel it right away. But chronic emotional toxicity, that's different. That's the little daily insults, the constant second-guessing yourself, the subtle manipulations. Just like the cigarette smoke for the mice, the harm just builds up so slowly, often invisibly, until one day you realize significant damage has been done. So, what did the study find? Well, this chart says it all. As you'd expect, the sham group, that first bar, had almost no damage. But look at that huge second bar for the 3R4F group. Constant exposure led to massive tissue destruction. But here's the most hopeful part. Look at the cessation group. Even after 2 months of smoke, once it was taken away, their damage was so much lower. It shows the body started to recover almost immediately. And this is the punchline, right here. The data from a mouse study gives us this powerful physical proof of a deep psychological truth. The damage from a toxic environment is very, very real, but so is recovery. The most important thing is that healing, real, measurable healing, can only truly start once you remove yourself from the source of the harm. But as anyone who's ever been in a situation like this knows, just leaving isn't always a clean break. The end of the relationship is often just the beginning of a whole new set of challenges. This is the fallout. Yeah, there's actually a term for this: post-separation abuse. See, a person with strong narcissistic traits often can't handle rejection or losing control. So when you leave, the bad behavior doesn't just stop. It can actually continue or even get worse as a kind of revenge. So how can you spot the risk ahead of time? Well, their past is usually the best indicator. Take a close look at these points. Do they talk about their exes with absolute venom, blaming them for everything? Do they have a history of really nasty breakups? Have they ever threatened to ruin someone's reputation? These are huge red flags that they might try to retaliate after you leave. Okay, so with all that in mind, what on earth can you actually do? Let's talk about the path forward. Let's focus on real, actionable steps you can take to protect your well-being, whether you decide to stay or to go. The sources we looked at lay out a pretty clear 4-step strategy. Step 1, educate yourself. The more you learn about narcissism, the more you understand the patterns, and the less personally you take the behavior. Step 2, set clear boundaries. This is all about deciding what your limits are and then actually enforcing them. 3, and this is so important, build a support system. You need friends, family, professionals you can count on. And finally, step 4, consider therapy. Getting professional help to sort through all this can be a game changer. And at the end of the day, it really comes down to this: a realistic look at the situation. Being in a relationship with someone high in narcissistic traits often means you have to accept that they just might not be able to give you the empathy, the support, and the connection that you really need. It requires a fundamental shift in your expectations. And so, that's where we'll leave it. The metaphor of the mouse study is so powerful, and not just for romantic relationships, but for any part of our lives. It really makes you stop and ask yourself, what are the slow, cumulative, and maybe invisible toxins that might be causing harm in my own life without me even realizing it? Something to think about.